Wyoming Territory. August 1883, the storm rolled in just after dusk, dark clouds bruising the sky above the Medicine Bow Range. Sheridan Maynard pressed her hand against her belly, her boots sinking into the muddy trail as she stared at the broken wheel of the wagon. She had known better than to travel alone, but she had not exactly had a choice. The last of her money had gone to the mule and the wagon. The rest her past, her family, her safety was gone. That was when he came riding out of the trees like something out of a story. His horse was black, his coat soaked through, and even in the low light she saw the rifle slung across his back and the calm steadiness in his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and young no more than 30, but there was a weight in his gaze that made her heart stop. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice low, rough from wind and dust. She didn't answer at first. She was too tired to lie. The man stepped down from his horse. He moved slow, cautious, respectful. "Wheels snapped," he said, crouching beside it. "You are not getting far in this storm." "I gathered," Sheridan said, arms crossed tight. He looked up at her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Name's Kade Rawlins. I have a cabin 2 miles from here. You can stay the night. I am not leaving you out here." "I do not know you." "No, ma'am. But I was raised right, and I will not touch a hair on your head unless you want me to." Sheridan studied him, the way his coat clung to his frame, the honest stillness in his stance. Her legs shook. She was freezing, and she had not slept in 2 nights. "Fine," she said, "but I ride behind." "Keep your hands where I can see them." Kade nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin was small but sturdy, tucked into a grove of pine. A fire was already built, and he had it roaring within minutes. Sheridan sat on the edge of a chair, wrapped in a wool blanket he had handed her without a word. He cooked beans and salt pork while she dried out. When he handed her the plate, she took it without thanks, but her shoulders slumped with relief. "You running from something?" he asked. She looked up sharply. "Not prying," Kade said. "Just seems like you are." "I am not running," she said. "I am surviving." He took that in. "That's so." Sheridan's fingers tightened on the tin plate. "I lost my brother in Kansas. He was the last of my family. My fiancé turned me out when I found out I was carrying." Kade's jaw moved, but he said nothing. "I was headed west," she said. "To start over." Kade nodded slowly, eyes on the fire. "You will, if you want it bad enough." They sat together in silence after that, the kind that filled a room gently and without pity. Sheridan watched his profile in the firelight. He was handsome in a quiet, weathered way, not polished, not showy, just solid. "You are kind," she said, voice low. Kade turned to her. His eyes were steady. "You are strong. That matters more." She stayed 3 days. The wheel was beyond repair, the wagon abandoned. Kade taught her to ride his spare mare. He kept his distance, but his presence was always steady, splitting wood, boiling coffee, checking the trail. He never asked for anything. On the 4th day, she found him on the porch, hammering a hinge back on the barn door. "I will not be a burden," Sheridan said. Kade looked up. "You are not. I can help. I can cook. I can mend, clean, even shoot if I have to." He set down the hammer. His eyes were darker today, like he had made a decision already. "You will be my wife before the snow falls," he said, "and my child's mother after." Sheridan stared at him. Her mouth opened, then closed. "I do not say things I do not mean," he added. "You are not just a woman passing through. I see you. I see what you carry, and I would be proud to carry it with you. You do not even know me. I know enough. I know you are brave as hell. I know you want a home for that child. I know you make the house feel alive just by breathing in it." Sheridan's throat tightened. "You want to marry me just like that? I want to love you. For real. Slow or fast, I do not care, but I mean to stay." She looked away. Her hands shook. "I have nothing." He stepped down from the porch, close but not touching. "You have everything." She did not speak, not for a long while, But when he reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, she did not flinch. That night, she lay awake in the small bed he had given her, listening to the wind outside. Her heart beat hard and strange. She thought of her baby, of the road she had taken, of his voice. Before the snow falls, she rose before dawn. When he came in from the barn, she was standing by the fire, coffee already warm. "I will marry you," she said, eyes bright. "But I want it to be honest. I want us to do it right." Kade looked at her like she had just handed him the whole world. "We will," he said. "I swear to you, Sheridan Maynard. We will." The first frost came early, glinting across the tall grass behind the cabin and turning the pine branches brittle with morning ice. Sheridan stood with her hands sunk into the wool of her borrowed coat, watching the sun break over the hills. She hadn't meant to rise so early, but her body didn't sleep the way it once had. Too much had changed. Too much was still changing. Inside, she could hear Kade moving boots across pine planks, the creak of the stovepipe as he fed it kindling. He didn't call out to her. He never did unless it was necessary. He gave her silence like it was something sacred. She stepped back inside, cheeks flushed with cold. Kade had his sleeves rolled past his elbows, hands dusted with flour. A bowl of dough sat on the table, half shaped into biscuits. "You're up early," he said, glancing at her only once, then returning to his task. "I didn't sleep." "Bad dreams or just the wind?" "Neither, just thinking." He didn't press. He cut the biscuits into clean rounds with the rim of a tin cup and laid them out on a battered baking sheet. Sheridan moved to the stove and poured water into the coffee pot. "You ever been married before?" "No." "You ever wanted to be?" "Not till now." She turned toward him, the pot forgotten in her hand. "You don't know what kind of wife I'll be." "I reckon I'll find out," he said. "Same way you'll find out what kind of man I am when I'm not patching roofs or hauling firewood." She set the pot down slowly, steam rising. "I wasn't raised to believe men like you were real." Kade wiped his hands and leaned back against the table, folding his arms. "I wasn't raised to believe women like you would still be standing after all you've been through. I don't know how to be soft anymore. I don't need soft. I need steady and honest." The biscuits went into the stove and the cabin filled with warmth. Sheridan moved to the fire and crouched beside it, rubbing her hands together. Her nails were short, one cracked near the quick. She'd always kept them neat before, back when neatness had mattered. "My middle name is Elise," she said without looking up. "And my mother used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. I haven't thought of that in a long time." Kade didn't answer. He crouched beside her, not touching, but close enough she felt the heat of him. "My father died in a river accident when I was 13. After that, my brother took care of everything. He worked himself raw." "I lost my older brother in the war," Kade said quietly. "Gettysburg. He was 22. She looked at him then. "You were too young to fight. Just missed the call up. I was 16 when it ended. Spent the next year hauling freight and trying not to drink myself stupid." "You don't drink now?" "Not since I buried my mother. She hated the smell of it." They stayed by the fire, the biscuits baking, the sun lifting. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to move. Sheridan reached up and unwrapped the scarf from her neck. "Do you have something I can wear for the wedding?" Kade tilted his head. "You mean a dress?" "No, I mean something yours." He rose and crossed to the small chest beside his bed. When he returned, he held out a folded shirt, blue chambray, worn thin at the elbows. "This was my father's. He wore it when he asked my mother to marry him." She took it with both hands, the fabric warm from his touch. "Thank you." He didn't speak again until she stood. "We can ride to town tomorrow. Reverend Krause will marry us. He knows me." "Does he know you're marrying a woman carrying another man's child?" "He'll know I'm marrying the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life." "That's the part that matters." That night, she sat on the edge of the bed with her hair undone, brushing it in long, slow strokes. Kade sat at the table, mending the strap of his saddlebag. The light from the oil lamp cast soft shadows across the room. "I don't want a big ceremony," she said. "You'll have what you want. I just want it to feel real." Kade tied off the stitch and looked up. "It already does." She didn't answer. She stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. "I want to be good to you, Kade Rawlins. You already are. I'll try harder." He reached out and touched her cheek, calloused fingers gentle. "Just stay, that's all I ask. I will." And when he leaned forward and kissed her, it wasn't rushed or claiming. It was careful, like something he meant to carry with him for the rest of his days. And she let him, heart steady, knowing for the first time in a long while there was no reason to run. They rode into Elk Hollow 2 days before the first snow touched the foothills, the mare's breath steaming into the brittle air. Sheridan wore Kade's father's shirt tucked into her only skirt, the sleeves rolled, collar buttoned high. Her hands were bare, fingers red with cold, but she said nothing of it as they passed the livery and the boarded-up mercantile, shuttered for the season's turn. Kade dismounted first, tying off the horse outside the clapboard church. The bell tower leaned slightly east, and the windows bore frost laced like veins across the glass. He helped her down with one hand at her elbow, steady and brief. Inside, Reverend Krause stood beside the stove, rubbing his palms together. He was a small man with a narrow face, coat patched at the shoulder and spectacles slipping low. He looked up at Kade, then at Sheridan, then back again without speaking. Kade said, "We'd like to be wed." The Reverend's eyes lingered on her belly a fraction longer than comfort allowed, then flicked to Kade's face. "You've brought no guests." "We don't need any," Sheridan said, voice level. Krause nodded once, slow but without protest. "Then let's begin." The ceremony was brief, spoken beneath the low creak of the wind outside. Kade's voice was clear when he gave his vow, Sheridan's softer but sure. When the Reverend asked if he would take her and the child she carried as his own, Kade answered without pause. "I do." Sheridan met his eyes then, and for the first time since the day she'd arrived, something in her unclenched. Afterward, they didn't linger. There was no meal, no music, no guests waiting with laughter or toasts, just the wind picking up and the weight of a promise kept. On the ride back, Kade said, "You're quiet." "I don't know how to feel," she answered. "It wasn't what I pictured when I was a girl." "What did you picture?" "A veil, my mother's locket, someone giving me away." He reached over and took her reins, guiding both horses side by side. "You gave yourself. That's worth more." That night, she unpacked the few things she'd brought: a comb with missing teeth, a folded handkerchief, a worn book of Psalms. She set them on the shelf beside his tools and the ledger he used to track supplies. No one remarked on it, but it felt like a line had been drawn in the dust, hers and his, now ours. Kade brought in more firewood than usual, stacking it high along the wall. "Storm's coming," he said. "When?" "By morning, I'd wager." She nodded, then pulled a quilt over her knees as she sat by the stove. He joined her, taking off his boots and resting his forearms on his thighs. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked. He shook his head. "Too many ghosts elsewhere. Here feels clean." "I didn't know clean could feel so quiet." He looked over, eyes catching the lamplight. "You miss the noise." "I used to think I needed it, but not anymore." The wind picked up after dark, rattling the shutters. Kade added another log to the stove, then sat back and watched it catch. "You ever hunted elk?" she asked. "Once, north of the ridge. Took me a full day to track the cow and another to bring her back." "Did it feel cruel?" "No, it felt necessary." Took her clean, thanked her for it. She pulled the quilt tighter. "Maybe that's what this is, necessary." Kade leaned back against the wall, head tilted toward her. It's more than that. She didn't answer. Her hands rested on her stomach, the fabric of the quilt shifting with her breath. When the fire burned low, he rose and extended a hand. "Come lie down. You're tired." She let him help her up, her fingers curling around his for the first time without hesitation. The bed was narrow, the mattress thin, but when he lay beside her, he kept space between them, his warmth a quiet promise rather than a request. "I don't know how to be anyone's wife," she murmured. "You'll learn. I don't want to fail you. You won't." She turned her face into the pillow. "You don't know that. I know what it means to stay, and I know you've already done it." She closed her eyes, the wind outside rising like a distant tide. In the dark, she reached for his hand beneath the quilt and found it waiting. He didn't move or speak, just held on. By morning, the world outside had turned white. The first snow had come, blanketing the trail, the barn, the roof in quiet. Sheridan stood at the window wrapped in her shawl, watching it fall. Behind her, Kade stirred, then sat up, rubbing his jaw. "Well," he said, "there it is." She didn't turn. "You said I'd be your wife before the snow." "I did." She looked back at him, eyes soft but steady, and the child's mother after. He stood, crossed to her, and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You already are." By mid-November, the snow had settled into the land like it belonged there, thick and unmoving. The road to Elk Hollow had disappeared under drifts, and the trees stood heavy-limbed, their needles bowed with frost. The cabin creaked sometimes in the night, the sound of wood adjusting to the cold, but inside, it was warm and quiet, and full of something neither of them had quite named. Sheridan moved slower now, her gait careful around the stove and the low rafters. Her belly had rounded enough to change how she moved, how she stood when she stirred the pot or laced her boots. Kade never mentioned it. He only adjusted the chair when she sat, shortened the woodpile so she wouldn't have to bend, and once quietly hung a coat hook lower on the wall beside hers. One evening, as dusk turned the snow to silver outside, she sat at the table with a spool of coarse thread and a square of muslin stretched in her lap. Her needle moved in even strokes, pulling a pattern she hadn't drawn, only followed from memory. Kade came in from the barn, snow melting off his shoulders, his face red with wind. He set his gloves on the stove edge to dry. "You're sewing," he said, wiping his palms on his trousers. "For the baby," she said, not looking up. "A swaddle." "My mother made one for me, though I don't have it anymore." He stepped closer, eyeing the tight stitches. "That looks like a pine branch." "It is." She used to say it was a sign of life that didn't give up in winter. "She sounds like someone I wish I'd met." Sheridan nodded once, then bit off the thread and tied it. "She'd have liked you." Kade sat across from her, elbows on the table. "You ever think about naming the child?" "I've thought about it," she said, folding the muslin. "But I don't want to choose alone." He rubbed his jaw. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my brother Thomas." She hesitated, then whispered, "And if it's a girl?" Kade glanced at the window. "Your mother's name," she shook her head. "Too much weight in that. I was thinking maybe Clara. It's quiet, strong." He reached across the table and rested his hand near hers. "Clara or Thomas. Either way, the child's got good names behind it." Later, as she stood near the fire brushing her hair, Kade brought in the cradle he'd been working on in the barn. He set it down near the hearth, its shape simple, lines clean, the wood sanded smooth. "I didn't want to show it till it was finished." She walked to it slowly, fingertips brushing the rim. "You made this," he nodded. "Took apart part of that broken fence by the creek. Oak still good, just weathered." She knelt and ran her palm along the edge. "This is more than I ever thought I'd have." Kade crouched beside her. "You have it now." The next morning, the air smelled of pine smoke and snow. Kade was out early, walking the fence line, checking for breaks. Sheridan stood at the cabin door, watching him move through the drifts, careful and measured, his rifle across his back. When he returned, she had coffee ready and bread warming on the stove. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the door, shaking out the cold. "Coyote tracks near the henhouse," he said. "I'll set traps tonight." She poured his cup and set it in front of him. "You think they'll come close? They're hungry, I wouldn't blame them." He took a long drink, then looked at her across the rim. "You ever trapped before?" She shook her head. "No. But I've had to defend myself." He didn't ask from what, he only nodded. "Well, if you want to learn, I can show you." She sat beside him at the table. "I do. I don't want to depend on luck." That night they went out together, bundled in wool and oilskin. The snow crunched under their boots, and the moon spilled across the field in cold light. Kade showed her how to set the trap, how to mask the scent with ash and dry grass. She watched him closely, then set one herself with stiff fingers. "You learn quick," he said as they walked back. "I had to." He glanced over. "Now you don't." She didn't answer, but when they reached the cabin, she touched his arm before stepping inside. After supper, they sat near the fire, Sheridan mending a tear in his shirt sleeve while Kade read from a battered copy of The Prairie Traveler. His voice was low, steady, pausing sometimes to turn a page or warm his hands at the stove. When she finished the stitch, she leaned back and watched the fire dance behind the grate. "You ever wonder what kind of father you'll be?" she asked. He closed the book, thumb on the spine. "I do. And I want to be the kind who stays, who listens, who teaches them to work with their hands and speak plain." She smiled faintly. "That's a good kind." Kade set the book aside and looked over at her. "You afraid?" "Of getting it wrong," she said. "Of not being enough." "You're already more than enough," he said. "You're just thinking like a mother." She met his gaze, and the firelight between them flickered like the breath of something alive. Then she reached for his hand, not out of need but out of want, and he didn't hesitate. Outside, the wind settled into silence. Inside, the cradle waited, empty for now but not for long. The wind had eased by December, but the cold had deepened. Snow no longer fell in flurries, it settled in long, whispering sheets, drifting waist-high against the cabin walls. The sky stayed pale most days, and when the sun did break through, it cast a hard light that made the world look carved from polished bone. Sheridan's time was drawing close. She rose slower now, one hand braced on her thigh, and her breath caught often when she bent or reached too far. Still, she moved with purpose. Idle hands made for anxious thoughts, and she'd had enough of both in her life. That morning, she sat at the table with a pair of scissors and a piece of oilcloth, cutting careful strips for a lining she planned to sew into the cradle. Kade was outside with the axe, working through the last of the stacked pine before the next storm came in from the north. The sound of it, each clean strike, echoed through the stillness like a clock ticking down. The door opened behind her, and he stepped in, shaking snow from his shoulders. A fresh scratch cut across his knuckle, shallow but bleeding. He didn't notice it. "You split your hand again," she said, setting the scissors down. "Noticed a limb cracked up high. Came down quicker than I thought." She stood and crossed to the basin, dipping a cloth in warm water. "Sit." He obeyed, wordless, as she knelt and took his hand. The skin was rough, the blood bright against his weathered fingers. She wiped it clean, then wrapped it in gauze she'd boiled the night before. "I should have seen it coming," he muttered. "You were thinking of something else." He didn't answer, but his eyes followed her when she rose. She moved slower now, but with more certainty than ever. There was no question left in her. She belonged here, and he knew it. "I've been thinking about the land behind the cabin," he said, flexing his hand. "Come spring, we could turn it for planting." She nodded. "Beans maybe, cabbage. I know how to keep pests out without wasting powder. I'll build a fence. Keep the mule from wandering through." She looked at him a long moment. You think that far ahead now. I think about everything, Sheridan. About you, about the child, about what kind of man I'll be when she's born. Cade leaned back in the chair, his eyes warming. I can feel it. It's a girl, stubborn already. Sheridan smiled, slow and real. Then we'll need to teach her how to be kind and sharp both, like a pine needle. That night, she woke before dawn with a tightness in her lower back and a heat spreading low in her belly. She sat up, pressing both hands to her sides. The fire had fallen to embers and Cade slept beside her, one arm draped across his chest. She touched his shoulder. Cade! His eyes opened at once, alert despite the hour. What is it? I think it's time. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling on boots with unshaken hands. I'll get the water started. You stay near the bed. No, she said, gripping the edge of the mattress. I want to stay by the fire. He helped her up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and brought the kettle to the flames. The cradle sat nearby, empty still, but ready. The hours passed slow and raw. Cade stayed with her, wiping her brow, holding her hand when the pain crested. She didn't cry out, but her fingers dug into his arm hard enough to bruise. You're doing fine, he whispered. You're almost there. When the child came, the air in the cabin changed. It felt as though the walls bent inward, holding something sacred. Cade caught her steady, then wrapped her in the muslin Sheridan had stitched weeks before. A girl, he said, voice rough with wonder. Just like you said. Sheridan lay back against the pillows, damp curls clinging to her neck, eyes closed in exhaustion. He placed the baby in her arms and she opened them without hesitation. She looked down at the tiny face, eyes closed, mouth still, fists curled and her breath caught. Clara, she whispered. Hello. Cade sat beside her on the edge of the bed, one hand on Sheridan's shoulder. She leaned into him, her head resting against his collarbone. She's perfect, he said. She's ours. They stayed like that for a long while, the fire casting gold across the floor, the snow still falling outside. Clara slept in the crook of Sheridan's arm, lips parted. Thank you, Sheridan murmured. For what? For staying. For choosing me when I had nothing left. Cade kissed the top of her head. You were never nothing. In the days that followed, the world shrank to the size of the cabin. Cade brought in water and wood, wrapped Clara against Sheridan's chest in the evenings and sang to her in a voice quiet and low. Sheridan healed slowly, but her strength returned in measured strides. She nursed Clara in the rocker by the window, eyes always on the land beyond the trees. When the thaw came in March, they stepped out together, Clara wrapped in wool. The snow receded from the fence posts, the stream behind the barn murmuring again after months of silence. Cade pointed to the low slope past the tree line. That's where we'll plant. Sheridan rested her head against his shoulder, and build a smokehouse beside it. I can salt meat come fall. He kissed her temple. Whatever you want, we'll make it. Clara fussed once, then settled, her eyes blinking at the new light. You think she'll like it here? Sheridan asked. She'll grow into it, he said. Same way we did. The land didn't promise ease, but it held peace. It held room to become. And in the cabin at the edge of the trees, with smoke rising steady from the chimney and a life built from hard-earned grace, they stayed together, no longer surviving but living, hand in hand. Always.